Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Okay. All right. Everybody knows the drill here. There's a couple quick things I want to share. So a few of us are trying to build a habit of writing. And so there's an open Zoom room for writers every weekday at 6:30. I'll drop this in the chat at the end of the slide. It's basically 1 hour. We just come to a Zoom room, write our writing intentions in the chat, and then write for an hour together. And that's been going really great this week. I think we had around 6 or 7 people on a daily basis this week. Another thing is there's a Metagame Slack channel. And if you haven't joined that already, I highly recommend you do. And I'll also drop that link in the chat. But I just want to quickly get into tonight's theme, which is this concept of hard versus soft discipline. And I think this is an important idea that will really help to keep at the back of your mind whenever you're doing any kind of accountability with anybody in the coming weeks. So first, it helps to understand what we really mean by self-discipline to begin with. And it's really this idea of aligning yourself with what you want to do, so that to pursue what you think is right, despite the temptations to abandon that. And it goes to the root word of desir, which means to learn, and disciplina, which means instruction and training. So self-discipline in a way is like self-teaching, self-learning to do what you think is right. And you can tell this is quite similar to the idea of sovereignty, which we initially opened with. But I want to add a couple flavors to it. And these are just, I guess, like my words for it. There isn't any scientific basis to what I'm saying, but I think these are useful concepts. In my experience, there's 2 types of discipline. And one of them is hard discipline, which is what most people think of when they think of self-discipline, which is when you reach this alignment of your actions with your better judgment through willpower, effort, or social pressure. So you could think of traditional accountability groups doing a version of this. You can think of whenever you try to get yourself to do something that is hard, like wake up in the morning, you're using hard discipline. And for most people, this is where the concept of discipline starts and ends. I want to propose to you that there's another idea, which we'll call soft discipline, which is when you're aligning your actions with your better judgment through better understanding. Now, this is obviously a little bit vaguer, so I think it helps to think of an example. Let's say you're trying to quit smoking. You can throw away all your cigarettes. You can try to practice willpower for a 30-day period. You can get your friends to hold you accountable. Or I actually heard this one example where somebody made some sort of commitment contract where if they had another cigarette, they would donate a few $1,000s to the KKK or something like that. Some undesirable outcome was related to the activity. And that would be a hard discipline approach. But there's been many cases of people quitting smoking through a soft discipline approach where all of a sudden they have an epiphany that it's bad for them and they stop. Maybe somebody in their family got lung cancer. Maybe they had some sort of psychedelic episode where their eyes kind of opened up to how destructive this whole smoking thing is. In fact, there's a study on this. The most effective smoking cessation study was a study where they gave a bunch of participants who were chronic smokers a reasonably high dose of psilocybin. And at the end of the study, over 80% of them had quit smoking in that one-time event. And they followed up with them, I think, a year after, and they had still maintained a smoke-free life. So clearly there are other ways, let's say, and I'm going to use the soft discipline model to refer to those ways where you have an epiphany or some sort of change in understanding, or your felt sense of relationship with the difficult behavior changes. This is related to this other concept that goes back to the Greeks called akrasia, which is acting against your better judgment through weakness of will. And for some, this is a useful concept, the idea that there are certain things that you want to do that are just hard to do And so you don't have enough will to actually do those things. And so to the extent that you don't do them, you're acratic. But then some people say acrasia doesn't actually exist. And really what's happening is you just never wanted to do the thing to begin with. You didn't really have the better judgment. Willpower didn't even factor into it. So these questions may seem significant. You may wonder what type of discipline is better in what situation. Does acrasia even exist? And actually there's people who have a lot of debates about this stuff. And what I'd say to all of this is that it doesn't really matter, because we're playing the metagame here, and we're evaluating the quality of these models based on their utility. And we are not maintaining any kind of commitment to any one approach. We are not going to judge hard discipline. We're not going to judge soft discipline. We're not going to judge the concept of acrasia. It's basically, the goal is to operate from a position of non-judgmental, a non-judgmental perspective, where you're able to use wisdom to decide which of these models is most suitable for what you're trying to do in the moment. And I want to flag this here because obviously this is kind of a broader topic, but as we continue to do various forms of accountability, it's important to always step out of whatever frame you're in, step out of even the accountability model, and just take a meta frame and look at what is actually the most useful for what we're trying to do. So with that, I want to talk about how this stuff relates to crews, relates to masterminds. Traditionally, accountability groups use hard discipline, as we described earlier. And I think there's a lot of stuff out there about this. You know, you create the commitment contracts. The prototype that we presented last week, and that some of you have started to practice this week, explicitly at least has more of a hard discipline approach, where you have a bunch of your commitments being tracked and you have people that are checking in with you. But what I want to introduce is this idea that good crews, the best crews, actually help with the soft discipline piece. And there's at least two ways through which they do this. One of them is the crews themselves. So these groups of 3 people in this case, but maybe up to 8 people, they start to develop implicit or explicit standards and values. Like you can actually write down what your standards and values are. And that those values start to subtly shift the values of the people within that group. So, and you know, they talk about how there's studies that show that people are roughly as healthy as the friends that they spend the most time with. There's that famous self-help quote that you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. These things happen through soft discipline. You're not looking at your friends and then trying to force yourself to be more like them. That's not happening. It's more so that over the long term, the standards start to shift your behavior. And then the other point, which I think is really the interesting one, and the one that I want to highlight, is that crews can help by shining the light of truth on everyone's blind spots. So if we go back to the idea that soft discipline is about getting a better understanding of a situation. So take the smoking case, you actually understand the full experience of what it means to be a smoker, right? When you develop that kind of understanding of how it affects you, how it's affecting your lungs, and all that information becomes more available to you, you're bringing the truth about the situation to a higher level of salience. And that's what's making it easier to overcome the smoking habit. And my hypothesis with those psilocybin studies is that's what psilocybin does. It kind of changes the salience landscape, and all of a sudden smoking means something else. Now, I'm not suggesting everybody have these, you know, epiphanous moments or take psychedelics. But what I am saying is that crews can do that exact same thing over the long term, as long as everyone in the crew has a commitment to telling the truth to one another and to shining light on everybody else's blind spots. So that's pretty much it. That's the main takeaway from this. And I'll stop there so that we can have some discussion. And to begin, I'd just like to hear openly from everybody. What does everybody think about that? Does this idea seem useful? Do you have examples of hard discipline and soft discipline in your own lives? I'd just love to hear from anyone